I'll wait for Mani to sit down first. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The topic, as you see, the struggle for reform in Iraq politics. And we have Professor Michael Hudson to help us with this, to go through this. He has spent, I mean, you look at him, you won't believe it, but he has spent half a century studying and working, living, researching Arab politics, in particular reform. Before I invite him to take the floor, I thought I must make one very quick reference to a report which has just been published about a month ago by the Human Rights Watch, and the Human Rights Watch report on reform in Saudi Arabia. It's a very interesting, comprehensive report which recognizes that there have been changes in Saudi Arabia. Many changes which have helped maybe less stifling, maybe to help ladies in the broad public areas, less rigid sort of segregation. But the Human Rights Watch recognize that these changes are not lasting. They recognize that there wasn't anything, there wasn't institutionalized or legal areas or laws to make sure that it continued. So there was a fear that should King Abdullah pass away, maybe those who succeed him may not have the same enthusiasm, or if his own enthusiasm should suddenly wane. So Human Rights Watch has suggested that maybe what they could do now is to codify, is to have laws which will ensure that these reforms or changes, as you want to call it, can continue. So, and there is another one, and this, before I invite you, Professor, and that it says, it's a very famous statement which says that when an evil government decides to go for reform, it is the most dangerous moment in its existence. So I leave it to Professor Michael Hudson to take on from here. Professor,
well, I don't know whether all of the governments I'm going to talk about are evil, whether they are stepping on the slippery slope of reform is also, I think, a matter of debate, and it's not entirely obvious. I'm going to speak rather discursively about the question of reform, but also about the question of how people who have been trying to analyze reform actually analyze it. So in a way, I'll be operating on two tracks. I want to say a little bit about the state of reform movements in various parts of the Arab world, but I'm also quite interested as a political scientist in how we in the profession have tried to understand what has been going on in this region in the contemporary period. By the contemporary period, I'm referring roughly to the post-World War II era. But let me begin, let me tell you what I hope to do. First, I want to begin with a discussion of recent election results and anticipated results in 3 countries. Then I want to slip more into the academic mode and talk a little bit about how I have tried to study this issue over quite a long period of time. And then I want to draw your attention to some of the recent new writing on the question of democratization, political reform, and so forth, because there has been, in fact, quite a lot, and some of it is actually, I think, quite important. I'll move back to what I take to be broadly the conditions that affect the condition of authoritarianism, or the possibilities for democratization in a very broad sense, and then talk very briefly about certain reform projects in the contemporary Arab political environment. And with a little help from my colleague here, the talk will be illustrated from time to time with appropriate slides. So, let me talk first of all about the latest election results. Because if you looked at the papers, looked at the television recently, you might think that the Arab world is well on the way to democratization, because there certainly are a lot more elections happening these days than used to be the case. And in the last few days, we've had a couple of quite interesting elections that maybe tell us something about the state of democracy, or the lack of it, in certain countries. We've seen just a few days ago the election results from Bahrain. And we are told, first of all, that delegates and candidates loyal to the regime of the Al-Khalifa, the Sunni dynasty that rules Bahrain, easily carried the legislature. We were also told, though, that the Al-Wafaq party, which is a Shiite party, won 18 seats, which is about all the seats that it could win, given the structure of the electoral system. And we're told, in addition, that the more militant Muslim Brotherhood Salafis and Sunnis actually didn't do so well. Independents came out very well, and a secular party called WAD didn't get anything. I think one woman found a seat in the Bahrain lower house. So, what do we draw from that? This is a kind of glass is half full, glass is half empty situation. It is interesting and predictable that in this election, as in so many other elections in the region, the elements favorable to the regime, to the monarchy, or to the republic won easily. And it was also significant that in the days before this election took place, there was a security crackdown on members of the opposition. That said, it is still interesting that within the narrow circle of opposition, there were certain shifts that were regarded as important in the ebb and flow of Bahraini politics. Thus, people that are sympathetic to the regime could say, well, it's really good that the extremists within the opposition lost a little bit, and it's also good that while a largely Shiite party got all it could, it didn't get anywhere near enough to upset the order of things or to challenge a society which has been troubled for a long time by a division between a largely Shiite population and an exclusively Sunni dynasty. So what I'm trying to get at here is that in the broad sense, you might say, most of us probably would say, that this election doesn't mean very much. It was pretty well foreordained. The closer you get into the sort of inner workings of Bahrain, some people would say, well, yeah, that's true, but still, the election did signify something, that there are certain kinds of competition, some winners and losers within the essentially marginalized opposition. Not saying a lot, but I think it's not saying that the elections are totally meaningless. Now let's look at another case. Let's look at Jordan. And here we have a couple of pictures of Jordan. Jordan here is Queen Rania, who was a very attractive and sympathetic liberal kind of person. trying to promote awareness among American teenage girls of the plight of women in developing countries. In Jordan itself, here is a female candidate who was vying for one of the seats that are allocated to women by quota, because otherwise they really wouldn't do very well, illustrating perhaps a certain tension between the liberal people at the top and the actual social mores and political customs of people at the bottom. Well, we've got election results from Jordan lately. They just came out. They're not complete, but we understand that the loyalists to King Abdullah have, not surprisingly, won a majority of seats. We also know that the major opposition group, the Islamic Action Front, which is a spin-off from the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood, boycotted this election. So we have results in Jordan that are pretty much replicating the results of previous elections in Jordan, in which loyalists, tribal-linked candidates are likely to be quite supportive of King Abdullah's pro-Western policies, even though there is quite a lot of discontent in many sectors of Jordan's population, particularly the poor, particularly the Palestinians in refugee camps and so forth, about his what they see as his compromises with respect to Israel. So, turnout in this election officially was said to be 53%. The opposition said no, it really wasn't. Maybe it was in Amman, maybe only 34%. But the results was supremely unsurprising. Now, let me tell you a little anecdote that Marbi Sadiki quotes in his very interesting book on democratization in the Arab world, which I will refer to later. It's an anecdote which he says indicates what he calls electoral fetishism. And this is a comment from the 2007 election. A citizen is quoted as saying, "I woke up at 8 a.m. Food was scarce in my kitchen. All I could find was some sugar and salt, but no tea. Hikes in food prices wipes off half my monthly salary these days. My depressing thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A man stood at the entrance. 'How can I help you?' I asked. He invited me to sell my vote for 50 dinars cash. I accepted, but on the condition that he bought my husband's vote too. He agreed, and we shook on it. Praise be to Allah, we shan't starve this month. I pray that elections are held every month." So we can conclude that elections have certain, perhaps unintended, benefits and meanings. Do we have a little clip, though, from the latest election results there?
It's in the alleyways of camps like Al-Wahdat that the boycott will be most felt. This is where the Muslim Brotherhood draws most support. One man explained why he won't be voting.
We want representatives we can trust, MPs who can deliver our grievances and stand up against Arab and Western country plans and defend Palestinian rights as Israel continues its settlement activities and terrorism against our people. That's our most important demand. Then we ask for equality as Jordanian citizens.
Others have taken up the electoral challenge. It's a decision that fails to convince the doubters.
These parliamentary elections are specifically designed to pass the peaceful negotiated solution for Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Muslim Brotherhood would only accept a just solution that grants Palestinians their full rights.
The Muslim Brotherhood has historically enjoyed the strong backing of the Palestinian refugee camps for supporting the Palestinian cause and the right of return. But many Palestinians here fear that pro-Western legislators and leaders would agree to a settlement that would never allow the refugees to return to a future Palestinian state. That's why there is concern here about the Islamist boycott of the election.
The government should open the channel for him to be a better representative, not only in the parliament, but in the grassroots level as well, in the public sector and provide public services as well. National unity is a very hot issue, and it needs really visionary politicians to deal with it.
The government is promising free and fair elections and says the new parliament will make amendments to the electoral law. But that's not believed by the Muslim Brotherhood, because it's traditionally their political enemies, the Bedouin tribes, the power base of the monarchy in parliament, that will end up winning the biggest slice of the electoral cake.
And that, in fact, is what has happened. A study that I will refer to in a few minutes, conducted by social scientists, a quantitative comparative study seeking to rank many of the countries in the Arab region in terms of scores on democratization. Guess who's number one? Well, you just saw it. Jordan is ranked number one on the indices of about 18 different indicators of democratic or liberal success. We might want to come back to that later. The third election hasn't happened yet, but I will draw your attention to it, and I will also mention that we expect here at MEI to have a post-election analysis of the Egyptian election, which will happen, I believe, on November 28th or 29th. And we'll be bringing Dr. Mustafa Kamal Sayed, who's a very prominent Egyptian political scientist from Cairo, to come and tell us what it all meant. It hasn't happened yet, but again, just as in the two previous cases, nobody is expecting to be very much surprised by the outcome. And that is because the National Democratic Party of Egypt, according to the Constitution on electoral rules and customs, and with the weight of the state behind it, is expected once again to achieve a comfortable majority. Which leads to the interesting question, why bother? Why would Egyptian opposition parties and groups even think it's worth contesting? Now clearly in the Jordanian case, the Islamic Action Front said, no, we won't do it. In the Bahraini case, opposition groups did do it, even though they knew they were going to lose. And in the Egyptian case, in a very interesting analysis by Muna al-Gabashi, she says that these elections are important, despite the fact that everybody knows that the incumbents and the regime party will easily win. Why is that? And she says in the Egyptian case, opposition groups enter elections not to win a majority, and certainly not to govern, but rather to build political standing. They cultivate new and old constituencies, lambast the government and advertise their own integrity, and seek places in parliament to counteract their exclusion from other national power structures. Given the default exclusion, to boycott parliament would be tantamount to accepting political invisibility. Now, this may not seem all that important to us, but I think it probably really is, and I mention it only to illustrate what I want to come to at the end of my talk, which is a suggestion that the state, despite its overwhelming monopoly of power and influence and resources, is not totally impermeable, and the regimes that control the state are not necessarily always fully in control of things. This is an argument that suggests that we should look inside the electoral process a little bit and not be too quick to discount 100% the whole operation as a complete fraud. Now, I want to talk a little bit, because as Verghese mentioned, I've been working on the question of Arab politics for quite a long time. And I'm turning now to a discussion of how the academics, the political scientists, have looked at the question of authoritarianism, legitimacy, and the possibilities for democratization in this region. And I'm going to start with the book that I wrote back in 1977, subtitled The Search for Legitimacy, Arab Politics, The Search for Legitimacy. And back at that time, and I was very much immersed in the dominant social science paradigm of the day, modernization theory and political development theory. My argument my analysis focused on leaders and regimes in Arab countries that had different support bases. This was a kind of extrapolation from the Weberian typology of traditional, charismatic, rational, bureaucratic leadership. And I argued that government performance was seen as a legitimacy builder. Back again in the 1970s and 80s, Samuel Huntington, before writing the works which he later became famous or infamous for, wrote a very interesting article called The King's Dilemma, in which he argued that the institution of monarchy was probably anachronistic simply because monarchies, by the nature of their sort of patrimonial structures, couldn't really develop enough capability, enough administrative capability to run a large modernizing country. Well, that turned out to be quite wrong, and perhaps one of the reasons that many, but not all, of the monarchies of the region have survived is that somehow the kings managed to overcome that dilemma. But I also indicated that there needs to be a strong emphasis on stability and security, a strong emphasis on tapping into powerful ideological currents. And back, remember, this is in the mid-70s, I had rather little to say about democratic legitimacy or meaningful participation, and nor did anybody else. If you looked at the writings of the time, people weren't really talking about the idea of transitions to democracy in this part of the world. Rather, the discussion was about how leaders mobilized masses with strong ideological appeals, or with personal charisma, or with a highly developed bureaucratic apparatus with a strong emphasis on coercion and security, the mukhabarat state. And that was sort of the way we were looking at it then. Well, a decade later, in 1985, 86, 87, I began to wonder whether we weren't missing something and whether there might actually be possibilities for democratization in this region where it just seemed to be foolish to even talk about such a thing. And at that time, I tried to suggest that there were both theoretical and also empirical grounds for saying that democracy might actually occur, it might actually take root in this unpromising soil. The theoretical arguments drew on the proliferation of civil society groupings. There was a discovery or a rediscovery of civil society at that time, the development of NGOs, of societies, of associations, not so much political parties, because mostly political parties were banned, but there were a few exceptions to that. But the notion was that given the nature of economic and social change, rising rates of education and media exposure and so forth, that the societies could no longer so easily be conceived of as monolithic and inert and passive and only sort of mobilizable by extremely dramatic and extreme ideological claims, that maybe something different was happening. And there were a number of studies at the time. We're talking about the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, which suggested that civil society was on the move, and the state, the Mukhabarat state, the national security state, was in fact retreating. And this was a broad proposition that I think applied both to the monarchical regimes, to evoke the sort of usual typology, and also to the what they call Republican or presidential nationalist regimes. So, and at the same time, in an area quite removed from the Middle East, scholars, again we will go back to Huntington, said there's a third wave of democratization, and at the end of the 80s, particularly with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, the idea of the triumph of liberalism and the associated democracy was, at least for a time, popular. It was popular among theorists. It was also popular among leaders. George H.W. Bush came to power at the end of the 80s and talked about a new world order. And later, Madeleine Albright, my colleague at Georgetown actually, now, as Secretary of State, spoke of the U.S. as the indispensable nation and the custodian of a new global condition in which liberal democracy would be the kind of political analog of economic capitalist supremacy in the world. So that was the way people were sort of thinking about these things, either as academics or as politicians. And on the ground, there were also interesting empirical developments at that particular moment. There were what we would call, certainly what we did call at the time, democratic openings in Algeria, in Egypt, in Jordan, and Yemen. There were the revival of democratic practices in places, the few places that had a certain tradition of quasi-democratic behavior and participation, in Kuwait, and in Lebanon after the Civil War. Well, that's all very well, but let me fast forward another decade to the mid-90s, to the late 90s. And unfortunately, for those of us that had proposed that democratization and liberal reform, could happen and in fact might actually be happening, it turned out on the empirical level that those democratic and liberal openings closed, pretty much. So there was quite a retrenchment. The Algerian Spring, as they called it, when the FIS, the Islamic Party of Algeria, was poised probably to win parliamentary elections, was shut down and outlawed when the military figures who dominated the Algerian regime declared that there will be no elections. And that ushered in years and years of a very bloody internal war between Islamists and Algerian security services. Egypt, although under the seemingly never-ending regime of President Mubarak, while it showed certain kinds of institutional independence at one point, the Egyptian court system in particular, on the whole, though, the Egyptian political order also turned inward and became much more closed, and for a very good reason. The reason being that extreme Islamist organizations were carrying out bloody attacks against Egyptians, attacks against tourists, challenging the stability of the political system as a whole, which gave a perfectly understandable excuse to the regime to crack down. And the Egyptian regime, with its single-party structure, the National Democratic Party, has in subsequent years and in subsequent elections continued to be very harsh on opposition groups, particularly those with an Islamic character, but not just those. Even liberal and secular parties have been marginalized and harassed and so forth. And this is a very telling and I think rather unfortunate situation, considering the fact that Egypt is the largest country in the Arab world, a country with a history and a tradition that goes way back, including a tradition of a certain political liberalism, all of which has really been stifled for a great many years. So you can have elections, and all these places have them, and a number of places that I haven't talked about, they have them. The question is, what do they mean, if anything? So a decade later, back in 1996, I had to reflect on all of these unhappy developments, and I wrote an article entitled "Obstacles to Democratization in the Arab World," trying to explain why these openings turned out to be so short-lived. And the explanations for that, I'll get to those in just a moment, have to do with the entrenched nature and the embedded interests of the state apparatus itself. So many bureaucracies have an interest in status quo. It has something to do with the rise of radical Islamist movements that elicited charges of concerns about subversion and revolution, rather than playing within the rules of the game. So now, having had to sort of backtrack, I was not the only one that was doing this. Others realized it as well. Having backtracked, we're now a decade on since then. I want to revisit the issue now and ask, is anything significant really happening here? So the state of play in terms of the way political scientists are looking at the issue of reform in the region is really as follows. At the moment, if there is a consensus, I think there is on this, it might be called a consensus on the persistence and even vitality of authoritarianism. Now that the democratic impulse has faded, theoretical arguments don't look so good for that. People have honed in on the question, why do these authoritarian regimes seem so durable? Why do they seem so durable? And indeed, why, as Stephen Heidemann has suggested, do they seem quite capable of innovation to keep ahead, as it were, of rising opposition movements? So let me talk a little bit now, as we look at the question of signs of change, and talk a little bit about recent writing and advocacy on the question of democratization. But here, you can see, to illustrate some of the points that I've been making, you have here the map of Algeria with the areas in green indicating the areas where the opposition peace movement would have won. Here we have, and what is happening here? This is Lebanon, yes, of course. This is Lebanon after the Civil War. The Lebanese cedar has been pretty much destroyed after 15 years of war, but the war ends, a new order, or not a new order, the old order is sort of modified and started up again, and the woman is watering the sprig there of a cedar tree. And Lebanon indeed resumed its electoral process, although under extremely difficult conditions for a number of years, conditions that have not entirely disappeared. Here we have signs of the election, the Jordanian electoral opening at the end of the 1980s, when after decades of emergency rule, King Hussein finally allowed elections, but the kind of elections that have taken place in Jordan since, as we have seen, have not exactly been models of openness. And then finally, in Yemen, which also had a kind of a democratic opening in 1990 after the two Yemens, North and South, were unified. That is to say, two one-party regimes ended up in one state, so you had more than one party. And indeed, there were more than two parties finally in the Yemeni elections that took place in the Yemeni Spring, which lasted from about 1990 through 1994. There was a brief civil war that allowed President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is still with us, still ruling, to consolidate his rule and to crack down. So there have been these spurts of liberalization and reform, only to be squashed. Now, the state of play today, let me just mention a few writers that I'm familiar with who have been working on this. Might be described as a state of cynicism. The people that are looking at the electoral scene that I tried to describe with those three examples are quite skeptical. An analyst with Brookings, Shadi Hamid, wrote recently that elections are free and meaningless. Professor Stephen Heidemann, who I referred to a moment ago, wrote an article a few years ago called Upgrading Authoritarianism, making the point that the state, with its advantages, with its huge material advantages, was able, in a sense, to keep ahead of nascent and growing opposition movements. If one can argue, as I did and have, and continue to argue, that in society there are factors making for more activity, more participation, more demands, accelerated perhaps by the development of new media. The argument that Heidemann is making is, well, you know, you can have the new media, you can have Al Jazeera, you can have these open spaces, but the state will always catch up and overtake you. It will find a way to use these new technologies for its own advantage, and always, in a sense, leave the opposition in the dust. There's a group of young, founded by young graduate students, some of whom came from my university, from Georgetown University, who established the Project on Middle East Democracy to try to not only to monitor but also to encourage activism, political organization, bringing young people together to try and encourage them to develop the arts of political organization and activism. A worthy cause, but I think you would find that many of the activists in this movement are themselves not at all optimistic that the young people can simply effectively challenge the weight of the state. You have the international community taking a big interest in the question of democratization, although in their more guarded language, the World Bank Middle East North Africa Development Report refers to better governance for development in the MENA area. Why do they do this? Because they are concerned that highly authoritarian, corrupt, and brutal government breeds instability, and instability could breed extremism, and that this is not a good thing from the point of view of large powers or from the international community. So there's a lot of work to try to promote democracy from outside. It can't be done from inside, maybe it can be done from outside. And in that vein, as many of you know, the United States government has taken, did take a fairly active role and has put a certain amount of money into projects for democracy promotion across the Middle East and North Africa area, with results that I think we'll have to say at best are only mixed. I referred a few minutes ago to a study that tried, through the use of quantitative methods, to index the performance of different countries in the region in terms of democracy and political reform. This is the report of the Arab Reform Initiative, an effort carried out essentially by Arab social scientists, and in its latest report, the 2009-10 report, it comes up with overall rankings on the basis of scores on about 18 different indicators of sort of structural indicators of democracy, institutional indicators, and also on the basis of practices of how, according to estimates and opinions, the political process actually works. They discovered, and you can take it for whatever it's worth, that of the 10 countries they studied, the one that came out best in terms of democracy was Jordan, followed by, I should ask you what your rankings might be. Jordan. I hear Syria. Okay. Who comes after Jordan? Not according to these people. Who? Bahrain? No, sorry, Bahrain wasn't in the study.
Lebanon.
Yeah, Lebanon's in there. You rank it pretty high? Okay. Well, let me tell you what they came up with, and then I have the report right here. You can take a look at it. It's quite interesting. Basically, it came out like this. On top is Jordan, followed by Morocco, followed by Egypt, followed by Lebanon, followed by Algeria, followed by Kuwait, followed by the Palestinian Authority, followed by, we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel here, I'm afraid, Syria, and on the bottom is Yemen. That's the way they came up with it. If you had seen this list of rankings, but you didn't know what was being ranked, I wonder, what you might have guessed. But we can talk about that later. However, sorry?
What's the criteria for?
The criteria are numerous. There are about 18 different indicators, and because I think we're limited in time, I cannot explicate them all, but I can show you that they really worked hard. The state of reform in the Arab world, 2009-10. So you might think, on balance, that this is not really good news, but they did report that overall, the overall score in terms of performance on these indicators of reform was actually somewhat higher than it had been in the previous year. So that's not a very long timeline to build on, but they did point out that things were a little bit better in 2010 than they might have been in 2008 on this score. Now, there are other people that have written interesting work on this, and I would be remiss, I think, not to mention a very prominent Egyptian political scientist by the name of Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim. Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim is an American-trained Egyptian-American, actually, scholar who, in the late 1980s and 1990s, was a strong and articulate advocate for political reform in the region. And for a number of years, he published from his Ibn Khaldun Center for Research and Studies in Egypt. He published a magazine called Civil Society, which was a very serious magazine. He had a lot of really bright graduate students working with him on this. And at that point, Professor Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim was optimistic, as indeed I was at that time. And he wrote, this would have been in the early 90s probably, that the proliferation of civil society organizations was impressive and ongoing. And he and his students actually counted up the number of new NGOs and associations and so forth, even political parties, although again, political parties are problematical because they raise so many red flags for the regimes. But he was saying, you know, we've got something's really going on here. Now, why do I mention this? Because the story of Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim does not end happily. As some of you will know, Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim himself was arrested and jailed at the detriment to his health for a long period of time on charges that certainly international observers thought were trumped up. His foundation was closed. And he was vilified in the semi-official press of Egypt as somebody who was basically working for the Americans. This whole business about promoting liberalism and democracy was an American project, you know, not in the interests of the Egyptians. And he was jailed. Finally, he was let out. He is out, but he is under arrest, and the last I heard that he cannot go back to Egypt. He's been an itinerant scholar, sometimes in the United States, sometimes in Doha and other places. And I mention his story just to, because in a sense it illustrates in the history of one scholar the ups and downs of the whole democratization and reform project. And I do think that the case of Sa'ad-ad-Din Ibrahim illustrates one of the real difficulties that have faced reformers in the region, particularly since the United States and the international community took notice of the need to democratize this region. And that is that when big powers undertake projects and start spending money to promote civil society or reform in Arab and Middle Eastern countries, there inevitably will be a backlash because not only will the regimes, but also many other elements in civil society will say, what is going on here? The Americans are trying to foist upon us a system that they think is the only system that is really worth having. But we think that they also have ulterior motives in doing this, that they want to intervene in our political affairs. It's none of their business, but they want to intervene, and we object to that. So this leads to the paradox that confronts reformists in the region today, and it's particularly true in the Arab region. That is that with, let us say that the democracy projects of the US and other foreign governments are undertaken with the best of intentions, with pure goodwill. Let's assume at the moment that that's the case. But on the ground, this kind of support can be a kind of kiss of death to reformers. The reformers themselves are torn by what to do. The POMED people that I mentioned earlier brought a number of young activists from Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and a couple of other places to Georgetown last year. And it was really interesting because on the one hand, these people are very realistic. They know exactly how difficult it is to express opinions that the authorities may not sanction. They know how difficult it is to organize, because the mukhabarats, the intelligence services in some countries, are very, very reluctant to permit any kind of gatherings of people. At the same time, they say, well, could I please have a grant from the National Democratic Institute or the International Republican Institute or the National Endowment for Democracy or one of the German foundations that's interested in this subject? Because we can't do anything without some kind of support, and we don't have any. So they are torn, really, between the desire to attract, to accept support that is being offered for their cause, and the opprobrium that will come upon them from other elements, not just the regimes, but in this case, in the case of these liberal reformers, also from Islamist elements in the opposition, who will say, you are unwittingly, presumably unwittingly, the cat's paw for a Western plot. This attitude reflects the ongoing narrative of anti-colonialism that has animated political life in this region throughout the 20th century, and I think continuing today. And if that anti-colonial, anti-foreign impulse was reflected for the most part of the 20th century by nationalist movements, it has now been taken over by Islamist movements using somewhat different symbols, somewhat different language, but reflecting, I think, a very similar distaste for the foreigner coming in and telling them how to do their local politics. Now, I want to mention finally, as we look at some of the recent writing on this subject, two important studies that are quite recent. And were I to teach a course or a seminar on this subject, I think I would make these readings required. One is the book of Larbi Sadiki called Rethinking Arab Democracy, published in 2009. Larbi Sadiki is a Tunisian political scientist, now at Exeter University in the UK, who brings a really deep theoretical sensibility to the question of democracy. He is quite harsh as he sort of disaggregates and deconstructs the language that is used to justify cosmetic democratic reform. He's quite strong in insisting that the democratizers put much too much emphasis on elections. And he calls this electoral fetishism. Electoral fetishism. If you've got elections, that's pretty much a sign that you've got democracy. This is something that regimes find convenient because it turns out it's not all that difficult, as we have seen, to organize elections whose results are not going to be a surprise. And it is also helpful for the foreign democracy promotion crowd to say, well, this is a perfectly good indicator. If we can just have good elections, that's pretty much the game. And so we find that as elections, in fact, have proliferated in the region. Back again, as I referred to earlier, when I was writing in the 1970s, they didn't even have elections, or if they did, they were totally uncompetitive. These were the 99% kind of elections. Well, today, there are a lot more countries with a lot more elections, and they're not all 99%. As we've seen in some of these cases, maybe they're only 85% or 75%. And we've seen that opposition movements are perhaps allowed a little bit of space. But to Sadiki, to use elections as your sort of primary indicator of democratic achievement is really quite inadequate. And that's one of his interesting findings, one of his interesting arguments. Another interesting argument he makes, and I think that this is really where I will end up pretty much in conclusion, is that we need to rethink the kind of binary and polar notions we have of state and society in this region. If we do that, we miss a lot. We tend, for example, if we focus, as political scientists mostly have, and certainly the kind of, the persistence of authoritarian people have relied very heavily on the fact simply that the state is invulnerable. The state is autonomous of society. It has a monopoly of power. It has a monopoly of resources. And as long as the state itself doesn't crumble from within or fragment from within, which can happen, there's not a lot you can do about it. Society will never be able to beat the Mukhabarat state. But that is reifying the concept of state, in his opinion. And by the same token, to imagine that society is a kind of monolithic thing, perhaps passive, perhaps irrational, perhaps apathetic, cynical, alienated perhaps, but fundamentally apathetic, then, what can you do? So I think if one were to critique, and I think one should critique the dominant thinking today on this subject, which is that authoritarianism persists and will persist, we need to reconsider whether the state is all of that, is all that ironclad, and whether society is all that mushy. And the argument that Sadiki makes, and that the other writer that I'll mention in a moment also makes, is that there is a lot going on between elements of the state and between elements of society, and to, in a sense, oversimplify the situation and assume that the state in the classical Weberian sense is that which has a monopoly of the use of force in the country and so forth, and operates on rules and regulations and so forth. This is not really necessarily the case. Now that, when we think about it, that doesn't seem so unreasonable. And if you look at the particular instance of a state in the Middle East that is least stately, as it were, Yemen comes to mind as a place where the state is a state of mind, perhaps, for a very small elite group of tribal and military and family people whose writ and whose rules do not run very far out of the main cities. When you get out into the rural countryside, and Yemen is a fairly rural kind of place, the notion of state as sort of master of the situation is highly contestable. And hence we see what we have seen in a place like Yemen is actually a fair amount of contestation because society, as it were, is so unruly. The state, while it can be quite brutal, can't really kind of dominate the place. That's an extreme example. But Sadiki would argue, I think, that there are other places where it is not so obvious, but it's still the case that the notion of state as impermeable shell or kind of an armor-plated thing that dominates society is actually overdone. And so the argument, therefore, is that we have to look inside the state, and we have to look inside society, and we have to look at the interconnectedness and the relations between elements from state and society if we want to get at the nature of the situation and make a better assessment of the possibilities for change. The other book, well, it's not a book. It's actually, it hasn't actually been published yet, but it's there's a political scientist, a Danish political scientist named Morten Valbjørn, and colleagues who will publish very shortly a special issue of the Middle East journal called Critique, reviewing again much of what I've been talking about this afternoon, the kind of intellectual history of politics and reform in the region. And Morten Valbjørn takes a rather caustic view of the way we studied this, referring to that particular period that I alluded to earlier in the late 80s and early 90s, when the political scientists suddenly discovered, or thought they had discovered, that the democracy might actually break out in the region. And he calls this phase the phase of democracy. And these are the scholars who were crazy about democracy, and they thought that, you know, it was practically around the corner. And he observes, as others have, that there seems to be a kind of a cyclical behavior, a cyclical pattern in the way social scientists understand these issues. If you looked, for example, at the great new interest in the politics of the developing countries that occurred in the early and mid-1950s, when many countries were finally becoming independent, there was a version of modernization theory that predicted or expected that as societies became more modern, they would naturally become more democratic. The more education you have, the more tolerant people will be, and tolerance is the thing, empathy is the thing. This is Daniel Lerner's famous contribution. And then there was the backlash, sort of thesis, antithesis, going back and forth. The conservatives, Huntington was among them, in the field of comparative politics, said, no, actually, this democratization is going to create more authoritarianism and more praetorianism because you'll have unruly masses and the urge and the need for stability will trump any kind of liberal or democratic impulses. And so what you might expect from countries that are rapidly modernizing is either chaos or draconian authoritarianism. So that was that. We're talking now about, you know, the 1980s. You talk late 1980s, and going back to what I said earlier, there were those that said, wait a minute, it looks like civil society is coming back, and with civil society, with all these groups, will come democracy. And besides which, there's the end of the Soviet Union, there's a kind of a liberal global atmosphere, and we can expect, you know, major transformations, except that unfortunately they mostly didn't happen in this particular part of the world. And that leads us, of course, pretty much back up to the present, where now that authoritarian gloom has set in, is it time, and what it's now doing here, to say, wait a minute, This is not the end of the story. Persistent authoritarianism doesn't necessarily have to persist. And if we take a more nuanced view of what the state is and what the society is, or rather what the state isn't, and go back and try to contextualize the state in terms of the societal identities and groupings and historical memories and patterns, we will see that the situation is really very, very fluid. So, I strongly recommend that the work of Larbi Sadiki and Morten Valbjorn as bringing us, I think, to a new phase. Now, having discussed the debates among the analysts, let me go back and just offer some very broad generalizations, which I think hopefully still endure, conditions, broad conditions that affect authoritarianism and democratization. I say affect because I am not ready to say that they cause one or the other. I think it's more complicated than that. But if we look, first of all, at economic trends, we have the phenomenon of oil and the rentier state. This illustration by the famous late Palestinian cartoonist, he was murdered, of course, indicates the poor Arab citizen leaning against a barrel of oil, reading about democratia, democracy, and the little guy who represents sort of the little man is just standing there looking, shaking his head in disbelief. The argument is, of course, that oil is a curse, that oil actually facilitates authoritarianism, that oil facilitates, as long as the revenues are in the hands of the state, as they mostly are, facilitates a system where the state can simply buy off society. So the oil effect, although we can certainly debate it, is probably one that is not conducive to reform and democratization. And if we look in the, very crudely perhaps, at the oil exporting states of the region, that means the countries of the GCC plus, let's say, Libya and Algeria, to a lesser extent, certain other countries are dependent upon exogenous forms of income that go directly to the rulers, like to some extent Egypt, to some extent Jordan. When you look at these, practically none could be said to have much in the way of liberal democratic political practices. In the GCC, perhaps Kuwait is the exception that proves the rule. So that's one thing. We have now, broadly speaking, the phenomenon of globalization. This is, of course, the topic, the concept that is much on our minds. Not quite clear entirely what it means, but one probably could argue that globalization has both positive and negative effects when it comes to Middle Eastern authoritarianism and reform. And the pictures here simply illustrate some of the more positive effects, perhaps, of the global role that is being played. Here is our former president, Jimmy Carter, who is a big advocate of democracy promotion. The Carter Center promotes, monitors elections in different countries. In fact, I have been an election monitor myself with the Carter Center. And there have been other groups, such as from the United States at least, like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, that have gone to countries like Yemen even, and Morocco, and Algeria, to monitor elections and to encourage the electoral process to be carried out in a free and fair way. The problem is, going back to this question of electoral fetishism, is that an election, on election day, an election may unroll quite nicely with only, minor bloodshed, not a lot of obvious coercion, and it still may not mean very much. And witness the quotation from the Jordanian lady that I mentioned at the beginning. There are negative aspects, and here I should mention these are other aspects of the democracy promotion process. These are signs that have been put up by various groups. Here's the Journal of Democracy that was published in the United States now for a number of years to promote scholarly work on the question of democracy. These are the signs of different NGOs in different places. There are negative aspects as well to the globalization trend. And if we can look at the, I think, slide number 9, we have here the presence of foreign powers supporting autocratic regimes. If the global situation is dominated today by the United States, we have plenty of illustrations of the Americans supporting leaders who could hardly be considered democratic. Of course, the famous one here is, of course, President Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. That was a long time ago, and people just weren't talking about democracy in Arabia at that point. We have other illustrations. Here is there's the Shah and President Carter. Yes, I remember when the Shah came to Washington one day. President Carter praised him as a modernizing leader and a democratizer because he had been putting a lot of pressure on the Shah to democratize. And there was a crowd of anti-Shah demonstrators at the foot of the Washington Mall, and they were making a lot of noise, so the Secret Service began to fire tear gas canisters at them to quiet them down. Unfortunately, the wind was blowing the wrong way, and everybody in the official gathering had to start wiping their eyes as President Carter toasted the former ruler. He called Iran America's best friend, apparently, at that moment. We have here President Reagan with Anwar Sadat, who succeeded another famous Egyptian leader who was also extremely authoritarian, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But Sadat himself, although he began with a kind of what looked like a liberal opening, he began to close it. And his successor, Mubarak, did pretty much the same thing. He began on a liberal note, but when things got a little bit too hot, he shut things down. And lately, we have our current president sitting down with President Mubarak of Egypt. We've already talked a little bit about Egyptian elections and what they mostly don't mean, but still what might be important about them. And everybody, of course, is waiting to see how will the succession occur. But the succession in Egypt, we can be pretty sure, will not occur because of some parliamentary vote or some kind of institutional transfer of power. It will very likely, well, we won't get into that. I'll leave it to our visiting Egyptian professor in a few weeks to tell us all about that. So, globalization and the way the United States, in a sense, dominates the globalization process can play a negative as well as a positive role. And then finally, getting back to new media and technologies, this is an important factor. And we have here, of course, some examples. There's Twitter for Iran. And in the latest Iranian experience with elections that were widely deplored, the Twitter effect apparently played some role in mobilizing, at least for a moment, a very substantial opposition in Iran. We have here, of course, Al Jazeera, which I understand is not easily available in Singapore, which is an interesting, we won't get into that perhaps, but Al Jazeera has been roundly condemned and by all of pretty much all the Arab governments for being subversive or impolite. And yet Al Jazeera keeps going, and Al Jazeera, despite everything, I think probably has had a very important effect in opening up the political space. So again, if you take new media and its various manifestations as another aspect of globalization, again, the prospects are positive and negative. Finally, here is a blog. Blogging has become very important, and this happens to be the blog of my former student, Asad al-Khalil, who is known as the Angry Arab to many thousands of people, I expect, by now, who will speak about as bluntly and criticize as widely as anybody I think you could imagine. So these are signs on the periphery that that society and people out there outside the official circles are not uninterested, or not lazy, or not apathetic. They're increasingly engaged. So that is that. Then where do we go next? I think we go next to the question of the changing nature of society. And this has various aspects. I don't want to simply sort of rehash the modernization theory of the 1950s. But I would like to say, I'm sorry? In a minute, perhaps. But the civil society of the present time has many manifestations, and we need to look at political culture and the elements that make up society, traditional elements, family, tribe, sect, ethnic group, etc., some of which are trying to fight back against globalization. We need to assess again the question of NGOs, which are continuing to develop, even though some of them are tainted by their foreign financial support. But most importantly, perhaps we need to look at ideological shifts. And that's what this picture is about, militant political Islam, which is the most powerful opposition form in the region today. It takes many different shapes, but political Islam, militant political Islam, seems to elicit broader support, and it certainly alarms incumbent regimes more than anything else out there. So political Islam, militant political Islam, of course, is represented by Mr. bin Laden. We have the international news media. Here's Newsweek writing about Islam al-Radikali, Haqiqat min Haqaiq al-Hayat. How are we going to live with it, radical Islam? And we have, of course, manifestations of that kind of activity. So the conditions that we have to look at, broadly speaking, have to do with economic trends, have to do with globalization, have to do with changing civil society, and in particular the power and perhaps the growing power of political Islam. And then there's the question, to go back to the state, the Mukhabarat state. Is it getting stronger or weaker? The advocates of persistent authoritarianism will say, well, it's pretty much getting stronger, that you can't really keep up with it. And I've indicated why Heidemann and others have made this particular argument. And there is no doubt, it is quite formidable. Here we have a bust of the late president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, who was certainly a master of the Mukhabarat. We have here demonstrators being beaten by the Egyptian police. And here, I'm not quite sure what that's the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International's depiction of how the state muzzles ordinary people. So if we're going to try to assess where reform is going, we have to analyze how these major, 4 or so major factors are mixing together to strengthen or weaken the reformist impulse. So finally, if we look at reform projects today, what do we see as we look around the region? First of all, let's suggest the following, that there are general considerations. The political system might be classified in terms of degrees of authoritarianism, from hard to soft. We have, perhaps instead of civil society, we should talk about the public sphere in Habermasian terms, small to big, extending of participation and contestation. My old professor Robert Dahl at Yale years ago, who wrote quite insightfully about democracy in general, proposed 2 dimensions of democratization that one should look at in making assessments about the possibilities for reform and where countries are on that. And it would be interesting actually to plot this out if we had hard data on a graph. But he proposed one dimension of democratic reform. It has to do with participation, that you would measure the extent of participation in a particular society. The second dimension is what he calls contestation. How much real competitiveness is there? One might say, and perhaps we can go here to this slide, one might say that, broadly speaking, the Arab world, to the extent that it has opened up in the dimension of participation. That is to say, there are more elections, more people vote, and so forth, whereas it has not done very well in the area of contestation, because competitiveness has been extremely limited in almost all cases. So if we were to look at the region today, just going down some selected countries, one might classify them as follows. Egypt we might classify as a hard to medium level authoritarian regime with a very large public sphere, because Egypt has a history of culture, of education, of organization, of groups, societies, and so forth. But ideologically speaking, the dominant trend, and the one that really scares the regime, is Islamism in all its forms, not just the extreme form, but even moderate Islam. Now in Syria, we have a case of, with all due respect to my Syrian colleague here, we have a case of hard authoritarianism with a public sphere that is very limited. You have to be very careful what you say in public, how you assemble, and there are not very many outlets for open debate and criticism, as some of the political prisoners that are still in Syrian jails would surely tell you. On the ideological level, it's a mixed bag. The Syrian regime professes to be most afraid of militant Islam, but there are clearly other ideological trends at work, from the liberal and secular to the more parochial. We go to Jordan, where we have, I think we could call the Hashemite regime a case of soft authoritarianism. You don't feel you're in a police state. The public sphere is moderately open, but it has been somewhat constricted in recent years. And the question of ideological tendencies really revolves around the related themes of Islamism and Palestinian. Do we have an illustration for that? Beyond that? Okay. All right. So, yes. Okay. Now, I want to go to 3 more cases, and these are the case of Saudi Arabia, where we have soft authoritarianism, the Mutawa are not as much in evidence as they used to be. A public sphere that is very limited, and Islam as the dominant ideology. In Kuwait, we have soft authoritarianism with a much larger public sphere, a lot more criticism, a more lively media scene, a place that in which there's a strong liberal current from the traditional banking community. Kuwait had a history of liberal nationalist tendencies, but Islam very much is on the scene, and Islamists can really shut down the Kuwaiti parliament if they choose to do so. In the case of Yemen, we have hard authoritarianism, but as I mentioned earlier, a weak state. We have a public sphere that is kind of split into different pieces, and Islam again is the dominant force that the regime itself tries to adhere to, but is strongly challenged by Islamist parties and by extremist Islamist groups. All of this is not a very cheery picture that I'm painting, but and it's even less so when you compare briefly the much more dynamic cases of the non-Arab Middle Eastern countries, namely Turkey, especially Turkey, but also even perhaps Iran. In Turkey, we have an active public sphere, we have democratic institutions, elections that mean something, a ruling party that is moderate Islamist. Iran is a tougher case with a theocratic structure, but it is a place that has had many elections, and at least the facade of democratic institutions, and pretty clearly a rather vibrant civil society despite the efforts of the Ayatollah and the ruling religious authorities to curb things. So, finally, how do we end up here? I think we have two key questions to deal with. First of all, do we see genuine, significant participation from below the regime? Or is it all essentially meaningless? Demokratia shakliya, as it is sometimes described as. Cosmetic democracy. That's the first question. Second question, is this situation really changing? Are we seeing any kind of broad kind of trend or transition? Now, I think if we try to answer question one in terms of Professor Dahl's two dimensions, we might say that in terms of the dimension of participation or inclusiveness, yes, there has been some broadening. But in terms of contestation and competition, there hasn't been much. Alternative leaderships and programs don't seem to get very far. So we might conclude that there is some liberalization, but hardly any genuine democratization. And we're far from seeing any really major transfer of authoritative power from one set of hands to another through democratic means. So the soft authoritarian model pretty much prevails. If there is any good news here, it is that hard authoritarian regimes are getting a bit softer as time goes on. And as for question number two, is this situation changing? I don't think we can make generalizations for the whole region. The Arab Reform Initiative report that I referred to here, if we were to take it piece by piece, shows ups and downs, and countries differ on different indicators from one another. But broadly, you might see some incremental liberalization, but not much democratization in several of the Gulf states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman perhaps, and in Algeria and Morocco in the Maghreb, but rather little in the Mashriq, rather little in the Eastern Arab world, not very much in liberalization there. Broadly across the region, Islam is the reform vehicle of choice. The liberal center does not seem to be gaining much traction. So my tentative conclusion is that reform and even transformations are likely, but that they will not necessarily take liberal democratic shape. That shape that typically defines what we consider reform in Western discourse. So we need to start deconstructing and investigating the societal area more carefully and the societal state interactions that I alluded to earlier. So following on what Sadiki and Bjorn have suggested, we need to get away from binary polarities, state versus society, look more at the interstices between them. We have to consider that states are not autonomous and impermeable, despite what the authoritarian upgrade school thinks. And we have to imagine that societies are neither passive nor monolithic. But in exploring all this, we need to be careful to abjure Orientalist stereotypes. We don't want to fall back on, I think, the now discredited notions that Middle Eastern societies are just sort of mosaics of ethno-sectarian solidarity groupings, and that's pretty much the beginning and the end of it. We have to be aware of the fluidity of movements within society. And so, with apologies for going on at great length, I will now stop, and if there are some comments and questions, I'll try to respond to them.
Professor Michael Hudson, your topic is very wide, and I have so much to say about it. I don't think we have the time to comment on all, but I'll say this. Democracy did not figure high in the imperial American agenda for peace. If you refer to the writings of Bernard Lewis and others, Ajami and Wayne, if I can put it, ask anybody intelligent in the Middle East, educated person, a young person, who will sum up the policy of the American policy in the Middle East into three factors. Free flow, ensure free flow of oil, and the suppression of terrorism, that is of course referring to Bin Laden and company, and the protection of the state of Israel at any cost. That has confused the whole issue. Never was to export a democracy. In fact, if you read Bernard Lewis in his books, he's always restrained the administration from getting engaged by force in the Middle East. Of course, in the end, he was agnostic all the time, but he was converted into believing that America should attack Iraq. And on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, he was invited to a secret meeting in the cabinet of Bush, and he endorsed it. And then he regretted. He wrote a book called What Went Wrong? Yes. So it's very confusing. The people in the Middle East do not understand democracy. They want primacy. Primacy, the right of the dignity of the individual. And that is the obstacle is that the American hegemony is protecting the semi-feudal state of Saudi Arabia and the other countries and discouraging the development of democracy. The civil society which you referred to has there have been many NGOs, the Society for the Lawyers and the Freedom for the Human Rights. They've been active in Egypt, in many countries in the Middle East, but they have always been suppressed because of the hegemony of America in the Middle East. Your policy is to protect the free flow of oil, I repeat again, and to suppress the imaginary or real terrorist looming high in the Middle East, and the safeguard of the security of the state of Israel, which is unacceptable to all the young people and simmering youth who are protesting at the moment. They want to have their own. We were not interested in the totalitarian democracy. We were not interested in the Western capitalism. In fact, it's failing right now. Thank you very much. May I have your comments?
Yes, well, I don't think I agree with much of what you've said. I think if you imagine a counterfactual situation where the United States wasn't there, would you find democracy in Saudi Arabia? Would you find democracy in Egypt? Would you find democracy in Yemen? Do you think that the distribution of a substantial amount of military assistance is what really keeps these regimes in power?
We will find a good governance. We don't understand democracy. Macedonian
I
democracy.
think it's really an oversimplification to blame it all on the outside powers. I think as I tried to indicate in my remarks, the outside powers have played a role in supporting certain regimes, but I don't think that it is this could happen if there were not local conditions that were also conducive to that kind of behavior. I think it's tempting, but it's much too easy to say, well, it's just the fault of foreigners. Yeah, should we?
Thank you, Prof. Hudson. I sincerely believe that yours was a kind of a landmark study overview, and I wish that it would be published and disseminated widely, because it's quite a nodal point in Middle East studies. This is my own understanding. Now, responding purely as a political scientist myself, may I be permitted to make 2 or 3 observations? The first is theoretical. The notion of the permeability of the state as a site of contradiction and contestation rather than a monolithic entity, owes much to Nikos Poulantzas, who made the point, analyzing what he called the crisis of the dictatorships, Portugal, Spain, and Greece in the 70s, and he proved right, because those dictatorships, some of 50 years standing, did prove to be permeable and unmutable, and in fact disappeared. But when we look at the Middle East, we are faced with one or two hypotheses. It can't simply be a question of the power of the state, because from the Austro regime of France through to Soviet totalitarianism or the Indonesian regime of Suharto, Latin America, you had authoritarian or totalitarian regimes come and go. Now, either there is something specific, not unique but specific, residing in the Middle East at the level of the state or society, which is holding back that kind of transformation. Or Middle Eastern societies have not yet arrived at a particular combination of conditions and circumstances that are obtained in those other states, which catalyze the transformation. So it's either a question of historical time, or it's some X factor. I don't know what it is, but this seems to me to be the two possibilities. The external, the natural resources argument, the oil argument doesn't really seem to hold water, if I make a bad joke. Because if you take Indonesia on the one hand and Venezuela on the other, Venezuela is not a paradigmatic democracy, but there's tremendous political dynamism and volatility. So I'm really not convinced by the natural resources rentier state argument. And I certainly agree with you on the foreign devil factor, because I mean, whether it was the Shah of Iran or Marcos, the American presence in and of itself does not prevent regime change. In fact, the United States has to adjust to whatever domestic dynamics there are and then get behind those forces. So I really don't think it's just the Americans holding it down. So what are we left with? I wonder whether the problem or the answer, the theoretical answer, does not lie in a disconnect between the usual social agency of modernity and democracy, that is the educated middle class, and the people, or notions of popular sovereignty. Because historically we see that it is when these two intersect that you have the Kerensky factor, which could be bypassed, but in the Middle East you don't seem to see today any kind of Kerensky factor. You don't have a middle class party or movement backed, which stands for democracy, anti-regime, but is also backed by a significant segment of the masses. What you do have are the civil society liberals who are discredited by association or not enough distance from the United States. And then you have a mass which is increasingly attracted to or monopolized by political Islam. Now, if it is possible to change that, and here I go back to a phenomenon that did exist in the Middle East, represented by Ben Bella, Mehdi Ben Barka, Ahmed Ben Salah, mostly in the Maghreb, of radical but secular, oppositional rebels, swatted at the time by the forces of the establishment in the United States, all of that. But it did happen. Now, if there's a replay of that in the new circumstances of modernity, globalization, alternative technology, and so on, then maybe at the level of civil society there will be an actual contestation between political Islam and a more progressive kind of phenomenon. But so long as there is this divide, where the liberals, the upper middle class, seem to be more Americanized than not, and you have the masses who are entranced by basically the mullah and political Islam, you will have this. You will not have popular sovereignty. There's no point in talking about individual freedom and so on without bringing in to the center the question of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty seems to be absent in this. Unless there is this reconnection, I don't see change taking place of the sort of we've been debating. Thank you.
Well, I think that's very helpful to allude to the Southern European experiments. There were places where dictatorships that you thought would last forever didn't. And I think there's a tendency now among those that are promoting this persistent authoritarianism to find it impossible to imagine that these regimes could fall or that these states could turn into something else.
Yeah.
But in fact, surprises always happen, and surprises have happened in the Middle East. Much was said about the regime of the Shah, for example, that it was coup-proof. That was the expression that was used in Washington. And it turned out, there was a conjuncture of forces.
Yep.
In that case, of course, it was not just Islamist forces. There were communist forces, secular forces, and so forth. And Islamists finally won, but it was not just that. And so I think that, what you have in many of the countries of the region, though, to get to your point about the divide between the sort of liberal middle class and the masses, is in so many countries the process of economic change has not led, as one might have expected, to an increasingly autonomous capitalist class with its own interests, with business interests sort of coming to the fore, which might argue for a more liberalized political regime. What instead seems to have happened is a process of co-option and clientelism and cronyism, in which the business community has basically struck deals with elements in society, in the state, to just get along. And so that is one of the reasons that you don't have the middle class, the sort of capitalist industrial middle class, carrying the ball. Whereas on the mass level, the appeal of Islam, in a sense, is almost a default variable. Because there's no really competing, today at least, no real competing sort of hot ideological alternative. And that has allowed radical elements to take root. But because the state itself has gotten into the authoritarian mukhabarat habit so fully, opposition movements have to be subversive. They can't be above ground. And so one has a vicious circle where the state says, aha, they're subversive.
Yeah.
And the opposition groups say, well, if we stuck our heads out, they can chop them off. So this is a real difficulty. I don't exclude the possibility that there will be some kind of a convergence here, or some kind of bridging of that gap. And I think one of the variables that we have to look at that we didn't address so much here is the question of governmental capacity. And this may not be such an issue in the very low population, very rich states that of the Gulf and so on, but in the big states where there are large populations, the delivery of governmental services is an ongoing and increasing problem. So if the prevailing cynicism that was reflected in the quote that I read at the beginning were to be transformed into outright anger, then I think things would be different. Yes, please.
I think that we can take an arguably entirely academic stand that no one factor is overriding in this instance. However, I mean, the mention of the American factor as having considerable influence on what's happening in the Middle East does not suggest that it is the only factor. I think that it's an important factor, particularly when the discourse from the American government is that they are supporting liberalization and democratization, and they are actively exporting such values, and yet they are also propping up authoritarian regimes. And of course, you know, the outstanding issue of Palestine and Israel looms large, even among those who want to advocate reform in the Middle East. So I think this is one important element. The external, maybe the external factor, which I think just have to be taken into consideration, particularly when there are cases of success of such efforts. South Africa, for example, okay, is a case whereby we have success in reform, in democratization, liberalization, which in no small part is affected by an external pressure. Okay, so that's one. Of course, that's the external factor. The internal factor, okay, but also, of course, you know, the American, factor is not overriding. And an example is Iran. The Shah of Iran was popped up by the American, government, and yet there is revolution. There is, from their perspective, a reform. So why did that happen? Halim Siddiqui wrote in his book on, I think it's Islamic revolutions. He cited the factor of the Islamic scholars. He's talking about the ulama. That, because even when you say that there are other factors, I think in that instance, an overriding factor is Islam. This is because this explains the emergence of the Islamic State in Iran. That actually the important factor from within is the power being held by the Islamic scholars, the Ayatollahs. And that to me suggests an internal factor, which is the undercurrent in all of this whole idea about reform, which is Islam itself, which is what is the Islamic QUE, a discourse on the position of democracy, on the position of liberalism. Because even in these parts, even in Malaysia, every time when there is elections, people talk about, you Muslims are to vote, in an Islamically responsible way. So now, what kind of discourse is happening there in the Middle East with regards to that? Because the Islamic attitude towards, the democratic process is very, very important. And I think it will sway, because I think even in the case of Syria, in the case of Syria and Jordan, any calls for boycotting the democratic process is that it falls short of the Islamic ideal, quote unquote. But there's one more thing, which is the whole idea about the democratic process itself. The meaninglessness of the democratic process is anchored on the very fact that there is no authentic opposition. That the authentic opposition or an alternative, because the meaninglessness here is about alternatives. What alternatives do we have? We do not have any alternatives if the opposition is spirited away. So as long as you don't have a reality, you cannot cosmetically, you cannot have the cosmetics. That's why it is called the facade of democracy.
Right. That's
because
why
there is no
term
legitimate, authentic opposition or alternative, to challenge. If there is, then okay, then we can talk about, and that explains this electoral fetishism which was mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, your point about the role of the Americans, I think, is well taken. You can argue, and I think Mr. Taleb, is right to an extent, that sure, the Americans are, we see it right now, but
yes, if I may, I'm very sorry, I left out Algeria, even though you mentioned, I think Algeria is a litmus test of that fuels the disillusionment of democracy, because as you rightly pointed out, the Islamic Party was winning, by all accounts was going to take over the government. In fact, I read early commentaries on what happened, which was really terrible because it was bloody. Okay, the army stepped in, and then there was civil strife. Thousands of people died and were killed. But the early commentaries were appalled at the silence of the Americans. The American government was pretty much silent in the face of this travesty, actually, in not carrying out the democratic process. Otherwise, the Islamist Party, through the real democratic process, would have won. So I think that is a litmus test in this whole idea of disillusionment. I think the Arabs, the young Arabs, have not forgotten this.
Well, first of all, with respect to your comment about the state, I think that one of the American effect is double-edged. And while the Obama administration may want to prop up Mubarak and not pull back on too much democracy promotion, the other effect is, I think, quite subversive. The association with the United States, and given the fact that the American positions on Palestine especially are widely despised, as it discredited, does not add to the legitimacy of regimes that are in the American embrace. But in some ways, the American effect can be quite transformative. And even, this is the paradox of the American position, you try to support a regime, you have, and I think there's no reason to doubt the genuineness of people in the United States that are in favor of democracy promotion, but the fact is that the messenger is so suspected that it has in a sense, the opposite effect. So, in spite of ourselves, we Americans may find that we are finally a cause of political change and upheaval when we were trying for exactly the opposite. And democracy promotion, we're for it, but only in very relatively small amounts. But I think with respect to the question of Islamist movements, I mean, what you're saying, I think, supports my earlier call for a much more nuanced reading of what is actually going on in society. What is going on within Islamic elites, for example, is very important. So the question whether, for example, Islamic authorities that are essentially linked to or mouthpieces of the state, their authenticity comes into question for those who would say, no, they're just mimicking official positions, and this has been a big problem, and that's partly why the sort of authoritative Islamic spokespeople who have, most of whom have condemned terrorism and so forth and so on, as everybody Americans wanted, haven't really turned people around all that much, and that there's still widespread anger in the Islamic world about American behavior. So I think you have to look at what is going on, within the politics of Islam within particular places. But you also have to look at interests. You have to look at the business groups, you have to look at the NGOs and so forth, and ask whether, as Diane was mentioning, this gap that we suggest exists between masses and the liberal elites can actually be bridged. And that's why I think, I think, we will see changes. There will be surprises, and when one of these governments falls for one reason or another, we'll say, "Oh my goodness, we didn't expect that. It couldn't possibly have happened, but it did." So we want to try to, get inside this and figure out what is possibly eating away at the legitimacy of these regimes.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to make a comment. Yeah, I agree with what you say, that a big obstacle to democratization are the totalitarian or authoritarian regimes themselves. Obviously, these totalitarians do not want to lose the power and privileges. But I feel that there is another source, another obstacle to democratization, and that comes from radical Islamism. If you read the writings of Islamists like Syed Qutb, he'll say that from these writings you can see that it is incompatible with democracy, the ideas. They will say that the reason for it is because they believe in the oneness of God, and that means God is sovereign, you see. Only God is the correct author of the laws of the state, you see. And these laws were revealed through the Prophet in the 7th century, and we're supposed to follow them. In democracy, people who are sovereign, you see. So the people are the ones who have the right to make the law. So to people, to these Islamists like Syed Qutb, it means that we are putting man on top of God. We are making ourselves worshipping a false God. We are worshipping ourselves. So that is the attitude. So if you have a group of people who believe in this kind of thinking, it's going to be a big obstacle to democratization. And that raises an interesting question, you see. What happens if in the elections you elect a party that believes in this, and this is fundamentally undemocratic? What happens if you elect a fundamentally undemocratic party? And that's what happened in Algeria, you see. And that's probably why the West...
Well, that's what the Algerian regime said would happen. That's why they...
That's
the
why
Americans said, we believe in one man, one vote, but
one
not
time
one time.
only. Yeah. Majority rule, but then after that, no more democracy.
No, but that's the paradox. But you have the do you want to defend the rule of the majority? Do you use autocracy to defend democracy? This is not just academic here. In the life of
correct. You're right. So that's why it's so difficult for democracy to take place in the Middle East.
No, but remember, you're alluding to a debate that has been going on for since the late 19th century, at least, among Islamic philosophers and thinkers. It's not that they all agree that democracy is a bad thing. The Islamic modernists in the 20th century have argued, and Islamic televangelists today, contra to bin Laden, contra to the Salafis, will say, that's quite okay. So I don't think one should assume that what we take to be sort of the Islamic opposition is uniformly against democratic practices.
Some of them definitely are.
Some are, but many are not. And there's an ongoing issue here.
We cannot reduce.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry, but
I just want to say we cannot reduce opposition against democracy from the Islamic world to Syed Qutb's ideas.
Well, okay, good. Yeah, please.
I am afraid I disagree with you because Islam is not against democracy at all.
But to Syed Qutb it is.
No, Islam is the Quran. And if you understand the Quran, if you read the Quran, there's the Shura. So no, on the contrary, Islam is prone to democracy and very near to the idea of democracy.
If it is, how come it's...
well, some people misunderstand Islam, some people misunderstand Christianity. It happens. It's politics, basically.
You can, but if you look at the Muslim countries...
Well, if you look at one of the most important Muslim countries is Turkey.
Yeah,
And
correct.
Turkey
But that's because
has
Atatürk-
a political party that is moderately Islamic. I don't think it's correct to assume that all organized Islamic groups are going to be anti-democratic.
No,
I
not
think
all,
I
no.
think it's a highly contested issue, but it's by no means assumed
I
that
agree,
that
yeah.
Islam is an anti-democratic force. And I don't think we can rely simply on the writings of Sayyid Qutb, who did not say the last word on this subject. Okay. Yes, please, Mr.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture because I've just come back from a conference on reform in Yemen. So it was in London, which makes this very, very interesting. I think you sort of like gone into my mind and sort of discuss all the ideas that are going on inside my mind. What was I going to say?
He can tell you.
Yes. I just want to highlight one issue, which is a question you raised. Are these regimes durable? Are they durable? And it brings back all the discussion together. It is for the interest of the United States. It is for the interest of even the current regimes. It is the interest for the business. It is for the interest of the world that we see a stable, predictable leadership in the Middle East, and hopefully that will be democratic. I can easily divide, create three baskets for the countries. There are some rentier countries where, as long as there is so much oil that's going into the pocket of the government, they can continue to buy the very few people they have. And unfortunately, the only country that had real big oil and was very populous was Iraq. But the other countries are quite small. And Iraq was invaded, and hopefully they were trying to create a democracy in Iraq. I don't know what will happen. The other countries are all very small populated. I mean, they can count the people in Qatar, 200,000. You can bring them all in one stadium. So it's easy for the state with such rich assets to continue to, but they are also delivering services to the people, which gives them some sort of legitimacy. Now the third, so that's the first basket. The second basket are the countries that are authoritarian and have been authoritarian for a long time and are fragile. The third basket are the failed states. I'm talking about Somalia, Sudan, and I don't know when, but Yemen is very much now coming from this basket to the other. So here, let's take an issue. I don't see, it is true actually what has been said about, just at a conference of American diplomats there, and the prime interest in the story of Yemen, and the context was reform, is that, fighting corruption will take a very long time. Democratization will take a very long time. And when basically what they are saying is that we will give these people the arms to shoot their own people. We will give Saleh. We will prop him up. We will support his because he's fighting. They have free hand to shoot, missiles at people, but they don't have a free hand. They say we can't change. It's for the Yemeni people to change to fight corruption and bring about democracy. We can't bring it in. But they can sort of shoot missiles at people and kill them because the regimes give them that power. Now, come to Egypt. I mean, it's becoming laughable now that Egypt, Hudson, I think, has forgotten about the idea of putting up his son, and he's going to run again for a term that will take him into his 90s. He will become 90 years old when he actually leaves office. How can the world continue? Because, for a simple reason, nobody can hint at him, Mr. President, I think you are getting old. It's easy. And it is exactly what, that's what I'm saying. I think my friends were talking about, and Muhammad was hinting at, is that, yes, the international community, America specifically, in this time of anti-terrorism war, is very influential in Middle East politics. In fact, all these fragile leaderships are looking for legitimacy from Washington. They are seeking that, and I know that for sure. President Hosni Mubarak took his son to Washington, and he had no official post. Mr. Saleh sends his son everywhere to negotiate with different presidents and all that. And all the anti-terrorism effort that is conducted into Yemen is through the nephew of Mr. Saleh. You know, and Mr. Saleh will tell him, please give me the money, I want to fight terrorism. Now, it is all about state capture. And I think the major barriers are these, I would call them landmark states. Basically, in the Arab world, there are Egypt in this side, in the republics. That is really the biggest barrier to democratization of the rest of the Arab world. And of course, in the other royal states, I think Saudi Arabia is the major thing, which is also, again, you know, for a small thing like, oh, let's allow women to go into banks. That is a great reform. It's not a great reform. Nothing much is happening. So I agree with most of what you said. It doesn't look too well. We just hope now we want to look at what can be done. I think what can be done is basically international honesty about it, and not continued hypocrisy about under the guise of this fear of Islamism. The people in the Middle East, and this is my final statement, the people in the Middle East have tried everything. They've tried nationalism. They've tried communism. They've tried capitalism. They've tried all sorts of ideas, and they have not failed. When you come to that conclusion, and then some people who look good, and they appear good, and they behave well, they call themselves Islamists. People will tend to follow. And I think that is a major, I think they should have let Algeria try an Islamic government. It could have failed. And no, it's not Algeria was the only litmus test. I think the second one was in Palestine when Hamas won in Gaza.
I think I think.
Yes, I think that is. I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm. The conclusion that I want to come at is quite simple. I think it's more honesty about how to deal with such idiotic leaderships like who?
Well,
you know.
Well, I think that's the most depressing statement I've heard. I think one of an interesting point was made over here earlier, and that is that elections certainly don't mean much if you don't have opposition groups. That is to say, if there's not some kind of organized movement, what difference does it make? In most of these elections, including the ones I cited, you know, that you'll have political parties are basically very marginal, and what you have are independent candidates, but of course most of those independent candidates are allied to special interests or to the regime. So the trick is for political organization to take place in society. That's why Egypt, in fact, is a very important country to look at, because of all the countries in the region, you would think that it had the basic building blocks to create, and in fact it has created mass opposition movements. So far, they have been marginalized, and we don't know what will happen next. But if you can't have those, if there's nothing in society that's going to allow alternative leaderships to organize, then you're not talking much about reform. If the reforms that will happen will be granted, not won from below, they'll be granted from above, and that's essentially what has been happening in so many of these countries where, in fact, if you recall my diagrams, you will see quite a lot of increasing numbers of what we would call soft authoritarian states with marginal symbolic levels of participation, but without any real challenge to the pouvoir, the power that powers that
What
be.
about the possibility of failure? I'm sorry, that was the last sort of idea that I wanted to put.
The possibility of failure?
Of failure of some of these states.
Well,
yeah.
Well, let's not get into the question of state failure because it's a highly subjective thing. Somalia and Yemen may fail, but Somalis and Yemenis will continue to live and operate. And I don't think I think states, in a sense, are almost immortal. It's surprising how few of them have actually disappeared when you think about it. One more comment, and then we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Why? We have to stop?
Yes.
Why? We have to go home?
No, you don't have to go home. But this belongs to
Oh,
somebody
it belongs
else.
to, it belongs to somebody else.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I wish we could go longer, but I'm told by our chairman that we can't. So thank you very much.